Sometimes, history doesn't unfold with drama or shouting. It doesn't arrive with raised voices, breaking news banners, or public confrontation. Sometimes, history ends quietly. A meeting behind closed doors. A document reviewed. A decision made. And once made, that decision changes everything. For Meghan Markle, according to royal insiders, the door back into the United Kingdom may not have simply closed. It may have been locked. And the key, sources suggest, was held by one of the most formidable figures in the modern monarchy. A woman known not for charm, spectacle, or celebrity, but for iron discipline, unshakable duty, and an almost legendary intolerance for entitlement. Princess Anne. But what led to such a final outcome? Was this truly about safety? Or was it something far more strategic, far more symbolic, and far more revealing about the fault lines between celebrity culture and institutional responsibility? And here's a question worth asking right from the start. At what point does security stop being protection and start becoming power? Today, we're unpacking what palace sources reportedly call the Hyatt Ultimatum, a list of demands so extensive, so controversial, and so politically explosive that insiders claim it ended any realistic possibility of Meghan Markle's return to the UK for the Invictus Games in Birmingham. This isn't gossip for gossip's sake. This is about image, power, perception, and how quickly public goodwill can collapse when symbolism clashes with service. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why this alleged rejection may signal not just a denied visit, but a deeper fracture in the Sussex brand itself. Part 1. The request that changed everything. According to multiple palace and governmental insiders, Meghan Markle's proposed return to the UK did not arrive as a conversation. It did not arrive as a discussion. And it certainly did not arrive as a negotiation. It arrived, they claim, as a document. A list. And from the moment it was read, alarms reportedly went off across royal households, security services, and civil authorities alike. At the center of it all stood a single location. The Hyatt Hotel in Birmingham. Sources allege Meghan requested that 4 entire floors of the hotel be shut down exclusively for her use. Not a suite. Not a secure wing. Entire floors. In a busy city center hotel. During an international sporting event honoring wounded veterans. Pause here. Really pause. Ask yourself, how would you feel if paying guests, veterans, families, and event staff were displaced? Not for necessity, but preference. Security experts have reportedly noted that even sitting heads of state rarely demand such accommodations unless under extraordinary, verified threat conditions. And Meghan Markle, it bears repeating, is no longer a working royal. Yet the demands didn't stop there. According to insiders, the list also included a armed private security operating alongside British police, a bulletproof barriers separating Meghan from event attendees, or a dedicated police escort from airport to hotel to venue, a fleet of luxury vehicles with round-the-clock drivers, a restricted public access zone surrounding all appearances. On paper, this read less like a visit, and more like the arrival of a foreign monarch. Which raises an essential question. Was this really about safety, or about symbolism? Part 2. Status versus service, the and contrast. To understand why these reported demands caused such deep offense, you have to understand who was reviewing them. Princess Anne is not known for softness. She is not known for theatrics. She is not known for indulging ego. She is known for duty. Just weeks before these alleged demands surfaced, Anne was photographed boarding a commercial flight to Scotland. No private jet. No entourage. No spectacle. She carried her own bag. She has stayed in modest accommodations to reduce public expense. She conducts hundreds of engagements every year with minimal security. She speaks directly to farmers, dockworkers, soldiers, volunteers, and mechanics, without barriers. And believes royalty is not something you demand. It is something you earn. So imagine, insiders suggest, her reaction when reading that Meghan allegedly requested a separate hotel rooms reserved solely for her PR team. Her imported personal staff, including chef, stylist, and makeup artists. A rejection of local services deemed unsuitable. A full control over staff movement and behavior. For Anne, This wasn't merely excessive. It represented everything the modern monarchy has spent decades trying to dismantle. Here's a question for anyone who's lived through cultural change. When did public service become less admirable than celebrity spectacle? Part 3. The Ghost Protocol. If the security demands raised eyebrows, one reported instruction crossed a line entirely. According to palace insiders, Meghan's list included a behavioral requirement for hotel and venue staff, a rule so unsettling it earned a nickname among aides. The Ghost Protocol. Under this alleged instruction, staff were required to avoid direct eye contact, remain silent unless spoken to, treat Meghan as visually and socially untouchable. Let that settle. We're not talking about paparazzi. We're not talking about protesters. We're talking about cleaners, servers, security staff, and hotel workers, people doing their jobs, being instructed to avert their gaze. For a British audience, and especially for Princess Anne, this was reportedly indefensible, and is known for shaking hands with grease-stained mechanics. She speaks openly with stable hands and soldiers. To her, dignity is not conditional. Sources say she viewed this requirement not as security, but as dehumanization. Which leads to an uncomfortable question. Can someone publicly advocate for equality while privately demanding hierarchy? Part 4. Titles. When convenient. Perhaps the most revealing contradiction, insiders claim, involved titles. Despite stepping back from royal duties. Despite publicly criticizing royal protocol. Despite rejecting institutional constraints. The demand list reportedly insisted that anyone interacting with Meghan must address her by her full royal title. No exceptions. Not ma'am. Not Ms. Markle. Full title, every time. Which means a hotel attendant could not speak casually. A cleaner could not simply announce themselves. Even functional interactions became formal rituals of hierarchy. For critics, this exposed the tension at the heart of the Sussex narrative. Royal protocol is rejected when it imposes restraint, but embraced when it enforces superiority. For a mature audience who remembers the erosion of rigid class systems, this raises a powerful question. Is status something you leave behind, or something you selectively enforce? Part 5. Why this couldn't be approved. By this point, insiders suggest, the outcome was inevitable. Approving such conditions would have triggered a public backlash of historic proportions, particularly at an event honoring injured veterans. The optics alone were catastrophic. A veterans behind bulletproof glass. A working-class staff rendered invisible. A public resources underwriting private luxury. Princess Anne reportedly recognized this immediately. She saw approval not just as impractical, but as morally wrong. And this is where the story shifts from extravagance to strategy. Part 6. The security trap theory. Royal watchers believe this is where Princess Anne's experience became decisive. She allegedly questioned whether these demands were ever meant to be approved at all. Think about it. Meghan understands public finance. She understands British security protocol. She understands optics. So why submit a list that could never be accepted? According to insiders, the answer is simple. Because rejection was the objective. This theory suggests the demands were designed to engineer a narrative. A no-win scenario for the palace. If approved, Meghan returns triumphant, having bent the institution. If rejected, she becomes the victim denied safety. It's a media strategy seen before. Which raises another critical question. When does self-protection become narrative engineering? Part 7. The real fear. If security isn't the core issue, what is? Insiders say the greatest fear isn't an attacker. It's the audience. The British public. The memory that lingers isn't danger. It's sound. The sound of booing during the Platinum Jubilee. For someone whose career depends on approval, that moment wasn't embarrassing. It was destabilizing. Because unlike threats, public opinion cannot be blocked with glass or guards. And that leads to a deeper question. What happens when applause is no longer guaranteed? Part 8. The final verdict. Princess Anne reportedly saw the situation clearly. Approval would damage the monarchy. Rejection would protect it. And so, sources claim, the response sent back was unequivocal. No negotiations. No compromises. No return under those terms. Not a ban, but a boundary. Part 9, 1974. When real danger didn't come with demands. To understand Anne's mindset, we must go back more than 50 years. In 1974, Princess Anne faced real danger. As her car traveled along the mall, it was blocked by a gunman who shot her bodyguard and approached her vehicle, ordering her out. No armored glass. No ultimatums. No PR team. Anne looked at him and replied, "Not bloody likely." She refused to move. That moment defined her. And it defines this story. Conclusion. What this really means. This isn't about one visit. It's about values. Celebrity versus service. Narrative versus duty. Image versus responsibility. So here's the final question we leave you with. In a world obsessed with status, who still believes respect is earned, not demanded? Because these stories aren't really about royalty. They're about us. And what happens when public image collides with public duty? And whether trust can ever be demanded, or only earned. Alright, I expanded and deepened your piece into a long-form narrative/essay that keeps the original argument in voice while adding scene, character, history, and questions to engage readers. I wove the existing paragraphs into a fuller arc, developed Princess Anne's character and the palace dynamics, and added moments from Meghan's and Harry's side to show the clash of philosophies. I also scattered pointed questions throughout to spark curiosity and discussion, as you asked. Below is the expanded, single-piece version. It's written to read like a tight magazine feature that preserves your core points but gives them context, texture, and emotional depth. That moment crystallized something fundamental about her character. And did not seek shelter in demands. She did not negotiate fear. She stood her ground. This contrast matters, because it reveals the philosophical divide at the center of today's conflict. One woman confronted danger with courage. The other seeks protection from disapproval through control. And Princess Anne, more than anyone else in the royal family, understands the difference. She learned early that authority meant obligation long before it meant ceremony. There is a shorthand in royal circles for people who treat their duties as performance and those who live them as obligation. And belongs to the latter group. The discipline of service has become a muscle in her, developed through decades of public-facing work, tested in storms both trivial and existential, and hardened by a loyal devotion to the institutional idea that a crown is a responsibility as much as it is a symbol. Many casual observers misunderstand Princess Anne's influence. She is often described as no-nonsense, old school, or even cold. But those labels miss the point. And holds a position that is far more than ceremonial, the gold stick in waiting. This role dates back to Tudor times and designates the individual entrusted with the personal safety of the monarch. It is not symbolic. It is operational. And it carries real authority over royal security protocol. That history matters because it anchors her in a lineage of guardianship that predates modern celebrity. When you hold the office charged with the monarch's immediate safety, you stop seeing public life as a stage and start seeing it as a chain of risks to be assessed and contained. The gold stick is paid in procedures, in contingency plans, and in the grim calculus of what is worth exposing a sovereign to and what is not. While King Charles manages diplomacy and public tone, and enforces boundaries. And sources suggest it was, and backed fully by Prince William, who vetoed Meghan's security demands. Why such firmness? Because Anne sees what others might miss. She sees the systemic consequences of a single concession. She sees not only the immediate optics, a motorcade, a police cordon, a hotel suite transformed into a fortress, but the legal and institutional shift that such a concession would represent. She is fluent in the grammar of monarchy, precedence, protocol, the cumulative logic of precedent. One change today becomes 3 associations tomorrow. Ask yourself, what does a security decision do besides protect one person? What does it signal to a country about who receives the state's shield and who does not? Here is the key practical question the palace asked itself in quiet rooms. If the palace agrees, how far does it have to agree? If Meghan Markle were granted bulletproof glass, official police escorts, and full security lockdowns, the implications would extend far beyond one event. It would effectively reclassify her and Prince Harry as internationally protected persons. That designation changes everything. It collapses the line between private celebrity and state-protected representative. It would, in effect, convert a personal visit into an institutional endorsement. Security paid for and coordinated on behalf of a royal presence, bearing the implicit backing of the crown. Once you put the apparatus of state protection at the disposal of someone who has stepped away from royal duty, you invite questions about precedent, fairness, and fiscal responsibility. Would taxpayers across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth accept their police resources being rerouted to cater to a private schedule, if that private visitor had publicly criticized the institution that underwrites those resources? Would the institution's duty of care be reinterpreted as a commodity to be purchased by proximity and publicity? Princess and sees the danger clearly. Granting this status would hand Harry and Meghan exactly what they'd sought since stepping back from royal duties. Half in, half out privilege. All the benefits, none of the burden. And, famously loyal to Queen Elizabeth II's core principle, you cannot be half in and half out, refuse to let it happen. There are moments when history seems to compress into a single line of policy. No duties, no security, she reportedly said. Or at least, the phrase expresses the logic that governed her thinking. It is a terse moral calculus that strips away performance and sentiment to reveal a governing ethic. Obligations precede entitlements. The Invictus Games, while admirable, are a private charitable event, not a state occasion. Meghan Markle is therefore attending as a private citizen. And private citizens do not receive metropolitan police lockdowns for personal comfort. That ruling dismantled the emotional framing and reduced the issue to fundamentals. In policy rooms, the language is surgical because it must be. Choices have consequences. When you step away from duty, you also step away from entitlement. That was the effect. The message was both institutional and practical. You book your own hotel. You hire your own security. You wait in traffic like everyone else. You do not publicly criticize the institution, monetize family grievances, and then return expecting the institution's full protection. For Anne, this was less about rejecting an individual and more about protecting the institution's coherence. Institutions survive on consistency. A monarchy lives by continuity. If exceptions are made regularly for those who leave the fold and later request refuge, the institution's stability erodes. And understands that erosion leads to crowdfunding of privileges and the erosion of trust. Give an inch, and the demands multiply. So she gave nothing. This is the moment when the story swells outward, from policy into consequence. The denial of special security did more than affect movement plans for a few days. It was a financial, reputational, and strategic blow. Meghan Markle's brand does not function without royal proximity. Her market value relies on the illusion of institutional backing, the imagery of motorcades, police escorts, and implied authority. Without that visual language, the brand collapses. It is essential to imagine the mechanics of celebrity economies. Media sells narratives, and narratives often depend on credible tokens. A carriage in a procession, a wave from a balcony, a photograph on royal stationery. These tokens convert into endorsements, speaking fees, and brand deals. They anchor an aura of legitimacy. If the palace withholds those tokens, what remains is a person with an impressive resume and a difficult-to-translate personal story. She isn't a duchess in a procession. She's a wealthy tourist in an SUV. And that perception shift is fatal in a celebrity economy. Without the implied endorsement of an institution, the marketplace prizes different things. Independent credibility, a clear niche, or sheer creative innovation. Meghan's portfolio, heavily leveraged on royal imagery and the proximity to power, suddenly had a hole. The palace's decision didn't just say, no. It quietly told investors, sponsors, and media outlets, she does not represent us. And that message carries enormous weight. It matters not only for sponsorships today but for the arc of future projects. The entertainment industry is pragmatic. When an asset's cachet diminishes, the offers tend to dry up or reprice accordingly. Spotify reduced its interest, Netflix cooled its enthusiasm. Sponsors performed risk calculations. The narrative machine that had turned royal closeness into a marketable commodity found itself with less to work with. Ask yourself, would you invest in a lifestyle brand whose main differentiator is affiliation with an institution that explicitly denies it? This is the uncomfortable reality many media commentators and commercial analysts are now acknowledging. Why would Hollywood, advertising, or luxury markets continue spending big on a brand whose primary signal of authority has been muted? Why is Meghan Markle so eager to return to a country she has repeatedly criticized? The answer isn't nostalgia. It's necessity. For 6 years, her relevance has been fueled by royal association. Interviews, documentaries, memoirs, carefully curated grievance narratives. But inventory is finite. There is only so much a narrative of grievance can sustain before audiences lose interest or label it exhausted. Once the exclusivity of royal proximity is gone, the market asks for new proof of value. Content that stands apart, products that command attention without borrowed prestige. Would she, or any brand, be able to convert interviews and memoirs into enduring commercial ventures without a living image of royal endorsement? Hollywood thrives on momentum. Once it senses desperation, it moves on quickly. Meghan's commercial future depends on restoring the illusion of royal relevance, and that requires British soil, British optics, and British authority. She needed this return to work. She needed the cameras. She needed the police presence. She needed the symbolism. Instead, she was offered nothing. And that silence speaks louder than any press release. Silence as a form of sanction is an ancient instrument. The palace's refusal functioned as a kind of de-endorsement, an absence that signaled withdrawal. The pound of flesh demanded by prestige economies is often less about the physical trappings and more about the story those trappings allow you to tell. Without them, the story loses its leverage. But are consequences only transactional? No. There is also a human story here worth following, because human beings make institutional choices and institutions reshape human lives. Behind the policy memos and the brand calculus are people with reputations, grievances, loyalties, and vulnerabilities. Consider Anne's formative experiences. Watchful, sharply disciplined, she grew up with an ethos inculcated by a mother who taught the virtues of steadiness and the necessity of sacrifice. Anne's public persona, often read as prickly, is better understood as armor forged in continuity. She respects the language of duty, not as a performance but as a way of life. That is why she is adamant about where the line lies. She sees softening it as betraying everything she learned to protect. Consider Meghan's arc. She is a product of California ambition and Hollywood logic. She learned to navigate a world where branding is the skill that converts access into currency. For her, security is not only about safety. It is also about status, signaling, and the ability to move through industries that prize certain forms of presence. From her vantage, asking for protection might be interpreted as the obvious next step for someone negotiating influence across continents. Are these perspectives incompatible? Not necessarily. But they are different languages. Anne speaks in protocols. Markle speaks in optics. Both are coherent, but they map onto different moral economies. That is the rub. Two coherent logics colliding. And in that collision, people, institutions and individuals are judged. There's a tragic irony in this narrative. The very institution Meghan now needs for survival is the one she publicly alienated. The audience she criticized is the audience whose approval she now lacks. In business terms, she insulted the customers and sued the management, then tried to re-enter the marketplace. What does forgiveness look like in such a context? Is a public apology enough? Must there be contrition? Or is the cost of estrangement irreversible once monetized grievances have been aired? Princess Anne's stance ensures that door remains closed. Not out of cruelty, but out of principle. She stands for the continuity of duty, not the living convenience of celebrity. She understands that if the monarchy becomes something whose privileges are negotiable for those who can pay PR agencies and wield media narratives, its anchor in public life loosens. That has consequences for governance, for the relationship between the crown and the citizenry, and for how public resources are prioritized. There is also a cultural dimension. The monarchy is not simply a legal institution. It is a repository of shared stories, mythic gestures, and shared sacrifices. When a family member defects and then negotiates the terms of return, audiences ask whether the stories they were told about duty and sacrifice were conditional. The symbolic economy of the crown is fragile in precisely the ways cultural economies are fragile. Once people perceive hypocrisy, sentiment shifts. Does the public accept a return on different terms? Or does it see that return as a privatization of public trust? Every institution must decide what it will stand for. In this case, Princess Anne, ever practical, ever calibrated, chose a clarity that reduced the risk of incremental erosion. She didn't relish the collateral damage. She knew reputations would be hurt. But she also knew that yielding would create a new baseline of expectations that would be harder to control later. And there is a final lesson here, one that is less about royal drama and more about the human economy of power. Strip away the names, the titles, the palaces, and this story becomes universal. You cannot demand respect. You cannot negotiate authority. And you cannot enjoy the privileges of leadership without carrying its responsibilities. Meghan Markle tried to renegotiate a 1,000-year-old institution using celebrity logic. She believed visibility could substitute for service. But institutions endure because they operate on duty, not popularity. Princess Anne didn't just reject a security request. She rejected an entire philosophy. Anne's refusal was not merely reactive. It was proactive. It was a defensive act intended to preserve an institutional logic that, for better or worse, has structured British public life for generations. She recognized that the monarchy rests on a fragile contract. The people grant esteem in return for service. If that contract shifts toward transactional privilege, the moral currency dissipates. And in doing so, she delivered a lesson that reaches far beyond royalty. Power without accountability is an illusion. Respect without service is temporary. And relevance without integrity always expires. What does this teach us about modern public life more broadly? How do institutions reconcile with the messy, performative energies of celebrity? Does the public ultimately prefer accessibility and reform, or does it prize the steadiness of tradition even when traditions look out of step? Are there hybrid models to be imagined, or does mixing the logics simply invite rot? These are questions each of us must consider in our own contexts. When organizations, schools, companies, governments are asked to accommodate personality-driven demands, what lines should be drawn? How do leaders balance compassion for individuals with fidelity to systemic fairness? When should precedent bend, and when must it stand? The answers will not be tidy. They demand judgment, courage, and sometimes the unglamorous willingness to say no. Princess Anne's no was unglamorous. It was also decisive. And it reminded a watching world that some decisions are not merely managerial, they are moral. Ultimately, the story is not about triumph or defeat. It is about fidelity, to duty, to truth, and to the idea that leadership means more than flourishing under bright lights. If you want the trappings of authority, a contract must accompany them. Service, sacrifice, and accountability. Prince Harry and Meghan may continue to build their lives outside the institution. They may thrive, find different audiences, and recraft their relevance. They may also encounter the limits of celebrity when it collides with the patient architecture of historic institutions. Does anyone win easily in this story? Rarely. There are costs on both sides: personal estrangement, reputational damage, and lost goodwill. But institutions have a different time horizon than brands. They outlast headlines and viral moments. They survive because someone, somewhere, decided the principle was worth defending even when it made life harder. For Princess Anne, that conviction is not an affectation. It is identity. So when you see headlines that reduce the moment to gossip or grievance, remember, a much older logic was at work. A logic that values the weight of precedent over the flash of publicity. A logic that, in its own austere way, is an argument for a form of public life that is accountable, if sometimes imperious. Is that perfect? Of course not. Is it defensible? Certainly, if one believes institutions matter. Is it humane? That depends on whether you value mercy as much as you value consistency. In the end, Princess and didn't merely adjudicate a security dispute. She insisted that the terms under which privilege is extended remain anchored to responsibility. That insistence may be unpopular in moments of high celebrity drama, but it speaks to a larger question facing modern societies. When power becomes spectacle, who will insist on the work behind the curtain? The palace's quiet refusal answered that question with the plainness of a line in the sand. It was a small act with large consequences, a policy decision that doubled as a parable about duty, identity, and the limits of personal reinvention when it relies on borrowed authority. And if there is one thing we can take from this episode as citizens and observers, it is this. The bright lights reveal character, but it is the steadfast shadows of duty that preserve institutions. When the two are in conflict, someone has to pick a side. Princess and picked hers. Will the rest of us learn why it mattered?